there. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Monday night. RfRx, the best night of the week. Miss Helen Greene, how are you doing this evening?
Good. I'm doing wonderful. How are you, my friend Cara?
I am doing well. I am so glad to be here on our favorite night of the week. What have you been up to lately?
Nothing exciting.
Yeah.
Like I had a shit week last week, so this is a new week. So I'm going to embrace the new and move forward by starting off on my best night of the week and kick some ass and talk about logical fallacies and all that type of shit, which is some of my favorite things to talk about. So let's get going so I can forget about what a shit week I had last week. Yay! And by
Yes.
hanging out with some wonderful people.
I fully support this. That's what we're all doing here. So I am so glad to be here, and I am super excited about our returning guests tonight, who we'll introduce here in just a minute, but I know y'all are all going to be excited as well. But first, let's start out the way we always start out, which is to hear from all of you lovely people with our first poll. And we're going to go ahead and launch the poll to get some of your initial thoughts on the evening, and I'll go ahead and read those questions to you aloud. So the first one is, which do you prefer, simple but right or complex and wrong? And the answer choices are simple, complex, I don't like the choices, or something smells bad about this one. Might be a little clue. Question 2, how often do you read, listen, or watch opinions that you don't agree with, or sorry, that don't agree with you? The answer choices are a few times a week, once a month, and I'm right, why should I bother with obvious falsehood? And then the third question is, beliefs should be defended and built on solid foundations in order to fight back against being challenged, destroyed, or weakened. And the answer choices are absolutely, beliefs are how we make sense of the world. Why would I abandon or concede ground to the enemy? This military metaphor makes me queasy. Or I heard about this scout mindset. What's that? So I will look forward to y'all's answers to that one. And while y'all are going over those, we'll continue to do our regular introduction. First of all, what in the world are we doing here? What is RfRx? Well, let me tell you what we're doing here. This is, as we said, the best night of the week, Monday night. This is our weekly show where we have a guest come on to discuss topics that might be relevant and interesting to folks in RfR. And of course, it's not meant to be a replacement for the online community or the support groups or anything like that, but it is meant to be a complement to those communities where we get to hear some good advice and coping skills and just have interesting conversations. And so hopefully that will again be the case this evening, and we're glad to see that you've all returned to join us again. As always, if you have any topical questions, comments, inquiries, death threats, or anything like that, you can send them to us over email at rfrx@recoveringfromreligion.org. So be sure and do that. I'm dropping that in the chat. And then also our previous recordings of RfRx episodes can all be found on our YouTube channel. So this is not the only one that there is. We've had, oh goodness, probably over 100 of these episodes so far. So if you like what you see here and you want to catch up on more, or if you want to catch up on some of our guests from tonight's previous episodes, of which there are a few, check out our YouTube channel and go look at those. And Helen, okay, I've been talking about RfRx. What is RfR? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Okay, so for those of you who have been living under a rock, recovering from religion is our mission statement is to offer hope, healing, and support to those struggling with issues of doubt and non-belief. So we do this through hope, healing, and support to the people that reached out with us. So let me start with healing. So you're going through a hard time dealing with issues of doubt, disbelief, dealing maybe with some family issues or personal issues. So what are you going to do? What you're going to do is they're going to contact one of our wonderful helpline agents, either through the chat or you can call in. You can do this 24/7, and somebody on the other end will be a trained, empathetic ear, one of our agents that are here to listen to you, offer support, offer resources, and a non-judgmental way. So that is the goal. You want to be able to listen to someone that's just going to help you guide through your worries, your doubts. That's just going to be like, hey man, let me offer you this perspective. Hey man, I got some resources for you. Hey man, it's okay to doubt. It's okay to question your beliefs. It is okay. And that is the idea. Now we're going to move on to hope. So I know one of the things that helped me when I was going through my deconstruction was connecting with people that had personal stories and things like that, are similar to my own, because we're all in this together. And even if someone's coming from a different faith background, the process is the same: deconstructing, looking at things, and getting to the idea where you're critically thinking about like what you've been taught. And that is the idea. So we do this through our blogs and podcasts. And also just by like you being here tonight, hearing different perspectives, that is the goal, like learning different ways of and hearing people's stories and how they work through the process as well. Last but not least is support. So I am a virtual support group. I'm one of the virtual support group leaders. I do my virtual support group every beginning of every month on a Sunday. So they were face-to-face. Now we're going back into face-to-face now that COVID's kind of going away, and I use that loosely. But we are opening more up to the public, but also too, we started doing these online, and I can say as a support group leader, I got to meet some wonderful people all over the world. And basically, these support groups are for you to get connected with other people. They're in the same boat you are, going through the same things. And while you're doing it, is that you can get people that want to listen to you, and you can support and care about each other. And you can find these support groups on our meetups, so go check out that. And you'll find a meeting you can put in your city, or where my group is that it's pretty much a free-for-all. So it doesn't matter where you're from, you can just show up and we'll talk to you because we're nice. So moving on. So on top of that, we also offer our online community. So if you call into one of our agents and you feel and they find that you would benefit from our online community, you can find support groups through there. We have all types of stuff like LGBTQ plus, former Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholics, Jewish, Muslims, any sort of religious woo-woo BS background you're from, you can find people that will support you, so you can join but you have to be invited. It is an exclusive club. We don't just let anybody in. You have to get behind the velvet rope, yo.
Only the cool kids get
Only the cool kids get into the online community. So be cool, and maybe one of our agents will let you in, but you have to be cool. Last but not least, like let's say you find that just talking to somebody isn't really giving you a need, and you actually need some mental health support by a professional. We have the Secular Therapy Project, and this helps us connect people that are seeking mental health help with professional licensed psychologists that are working from a secular model. You're not going to be told to like pray it away, or to like grab some crystals and hope that they'll heal you or anything like that. These are people that are doing the science, doing the recent psychological research, and proven therapies that actually help people deal with their issues and heal from those issues and become healthier and happier. So that is it for me. So go ahead, Cara.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for that. Also, if, for example, you have moved in your journey to where you are wanting to be in an atheist forum or community, we also want to give a shout out to our friends over at the Atheist Community of Discord, who also stream our shows every evening and are doing so now. And they have a great Discord channel that you can join if you're savvy with all the social medias and things. So I'm going to drop the link to that in the chat as well. So feel free to go over and visit them. They have a lively Discord channel. I believe they're called channels. I promise.
Yes, there's I'm on Discord. I'm on the Discord. It's channels.
Okay, yay. Yay, words.
Yeah, you're good at words, Cara. I'm impressed.
And wording. Yes. So definitely check that out. And then lastly, volunteering. Okay, this is another thing you can do. In fact, when we were talking about healing earlier, this can actually be a part of healing, just through helping others. A lot of people find meaning and purpose in just doing something like volunteering to help other people go through, something similar to what they went through. And RfR is completely voluntary. The whole organization is run by volunteers. Nobody here is getting paid for anything. So as it turns out, we're always in need of volunteers. There's always more work to be done. So if any of the things that Helen just described sounded like something you might be good at or would like to get trained in or involved in, then definitely come and let us know. I'm going to put a link in the chat where you can find out more about volunteering for recovering from religion, but there are all sorts of things you can do, not even just the ones that we mentioned above. Any kind of skills that you have, we probably have a need for them. Maybe you're good at the technologies, as I obviously am not. Maybe you know how to put things on YouTube. Maybe you have project management skills. Maybe you're, very good at something else that I haven't mentioned. Well, let us know what that is, and I bet we can find a place to put you to work. So definitely check that out. Okay, if you're called to do so. Wink, wink. Okay, moving on.
You have to hear the spirit.
Yes, if the spirit moves you, go for it. If not, I don't know what to tell you. Keep waiting. Just kidding. Don't wait. Don't wait for that. Okay, let's go on to the actual show, shall we? Okay, the format for tonight's show will be the same as it always is. We'll have discussion with our guests for about an hour, followed by a 20-minute or so Q&A session. And in order for us to have a successful Q&A session, we need questions. So during the presentation, if any questions come into your mind that you would like to ask the speaker, go ahead and just type those into the chat, and we'll be collecting those and asking as many of them as we can at the end. We can't promise that we'll get to every single question, but we are definitely going to try to get through as many as possible. So if you have a question during the show, just write question and a colon. Yes, thank you, Rob, put that in the chat, and then we'll collect those. And then after that, we'll have some closing thoughts, and then we'll move into our hangout session. And that is where we turn off the cameras, or turn off the recording anyway, and you all can unmute yourselves and talk and discuss and ask questions and continue the conversation in a more interactive way. So we will have that at the end, as we always do. And that is it. Helen, are you ready to introduce our fantastic and amazing returning guest?
Oh, I totally am. And so I am going to introduce one of our wonderful returning guests. His name is David Teachout, and he is a mental health therapist and photographer focused on teaching how creativity intersects with mental flexibility and working through the inevitable difficulties in life. David grew up in a Christian fundamentalist, attending a Bible college, receiving a bachelor's in theology and psychology. During his studies there, David deconverted and has been on the journey of deeply appreciating the many nuances of humanity ever since. David has a master's in both forensic psychology and counseling psychology, and is currently at work on a doctorate in clinical psychology. David has been actively working within the field of psychology as a therapist, social worker, advocate, and subject matter expert for over 15 years. In his spare time, David enjoys reading a copious amount, both fiction and nonfiction, exploring perspective through photography, and maintains a blog at www.lifeleavings.com and a podcast at www.humanitiesvalues.com. So David, welcome. Thank you for being with us tonight, and take it away.
Thank you for that. That was get weird because you write your bio and then you hear it like, oh, I want to tweak a couple of things about that. But yeah, it's weird. So yeah,
sounded pretty impressive to me. Don't change anything.
You don't. Okay. All right. Yeah. It's one of those things where you hear the stuff you say and you've done, and you go, "Oh, no wonder I'm busy." Like, okay, like there it is. Yeah.
There's
Forever
that.
forgetting what I end up doing. Um, but yeah, the blog is at lifeweavings.com. The podcast, yes, is at Humanities Values, but you can listen to it literally anywhere. I took a bit of a hiatus from making episodes and just released one about 10 days ago, and working on another one because there's been a few things in the news. So like to tackle all these things from a psych perspective. In fact, I was just joking with, and not really haha, but joking with my wife the other day about I recently have transitioned to being a full-time therapist and coach, and I'm just in the last like 3 weeks, and I'm like, of course I had to pick the time to do this when everything blows up so socially. So it's been, yeah, actually the timing could be good because there's a lot of people out there that need to chat and happy to connect. So, but at the same time, it's like, wow, there's a lot of heavy stuff out there. And
Well,
yeah,
thank you, because we need more people of you right there, because the world is crazy and we need more supportive, caring people in the world. So thank you, David, from all of us that appreciate the work that you're doing.
I am
Yes.
certainly not for everybody. I will put that out there.
You're for somebody, David.
Yeah. My style is what it is. But anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. So what we are here to talk about. So the title is Intuition and Simplicity: Why It's So Enticing. And in many ways, given the fact of just how much things have been happening just in the last couple of years, we've got plenty of examples. But I'm actually going to try to stick with examples in poking at things that may in fact be the quote unquote sacred cows of more secular ideas, because if we're not challenging ourselves, then really who is? So always a good thing to practice. And in fact, we'll get into that a bit more, why that's important. Thank you everybody for going through the questions. I always have fun coming up with these because they're silly on purpose a bit. They are to inspire some thinking. At the same time, it's to get into just a fun mood, because as was already mentioned, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. I will endeavor never to say your name, but if I notice a question that is really relevant, I try to be as organic as possible in the presentation, because I want to address as many of them as possible. And I will be hanging out afterwards for a while, so which is always a lot of fun. We get into some pretty fun chats there. So if you have any like mental health questions in particular, stick around and we'll kind of go through that.
Okay, you did that to yourself, David. You're going to be here all night now.
After so many years studying this, I either love it or I need to be committed. So I'm just going to stick with loving it. And
we'll stick with option one.
We'll stick with option one. Yeah. So I love the fact. Thank you for the 13 out of the 26 that said that the military metaphor makes me queasy. In that last question, we'll actually go through that. If I'm going to be looking at Julia Galef's The Scout Mindset book, fairly a lot in the latter half here. So if you haven't encountered that, if I remember right, she may have actually presented on RfR.
Ooh,
did she?
You are putting me on the spot. It is quite possible.
Okay, I know I've mentioned her more than once. And Rob may have, and others have definitely mentioned, but highly recommend. I was going back through it again today in preparation for tonight, and it got me between the eyes a couple times, because I have not been doing great recently on some of the principles for being a scout and really caring more about conversation than about being right. And so it's a nice way to be reflective.
We need to have her on if we haven't previously. So Good
Yes, yeah,
plug
that would be an
there.
amazing coup.
Yes.
So
You
yeah,
know
well,
that you're using a lot of military metaphors there, aren't you?
I don't know, I'm stuck on it. Like, I mean, it's gonna be, yeah. It's like
So rather
we're gonna
than boat
cross that
puns,
bridge
I was going to say,
and
we're not doing boat
assault.
puns.
we're
Yeah.
doing military puns this evening, I see. Okay, chat. You have your assignment. You have your
You have your
orders.
assignment.
All right,
That'll
I'm standing
be
at attention now. Let's go.
It's awesome. All right. All right.
Everyone hop too. Okay, promise not to derail it. I don't
Too
promise
much here.
that at all. Okay, sorry. Let's get back to it. Tell us,
I
David,
totally
about.
set that up, so we're
Yes,
good.
you did. You
So
did set yourself up for that.
I did, yeah. So I'm like, wait, how many people are still around? Awesome, we still have more. Awesome, we haven't all left yet. So looking at, when people talk about, or one of the best, most mentioned things, particularly when you're first leaving religion, often is this whole thing called Occam's razor, and in this idea that, well, supposedly simplicity is what we want. It's what is the almost synonymous with truth, and we want to go there. Unfortunately, of course, Occam was never actually about the simplicity. That's a bit of a misnomer that's kind of been carried along. It's kind of like the notions of the Alaskan Inuit have 100 words or growing on snow, that you only use 10% of your brain, and a whole bunch of other canards that just won't die. And so what the Occam's razor was really looking at is you do not multiply, this is my own phrasing about this, but do not multiply assumptions, and here's the key, in an unwarranted way. So it's not that assumptions are bad. It's not that assumptions are inherently problematic or lead you away from finding, I'm going to hesitate to use the word truth here. I definitely am using it in a lower T kind of way, but and getting away from the absolutism. But and this is a heuristic. It's a way of organizing one's analysis. It is not a hard and fast, like, absolute rule to be applied as a bludgeon against anything that simply appears simple to you, or that might appear complex. Because, and here we have it, what exactly do those words mean? What is the nature of simple? What is, there's so lowercase t, true, yes, absolutely. And so, and part of this is that, it's like, okay, well, what are we looking at when we think about simple? Are we thinking about it from a functional standpoint? I mean, for that matter, if anybody has heard, and I'm totally going to date myself by this reference, but Michael Behe, in the intelligent design community, he was huge like 20 years ago, I think, maybe 25. I'm going to stop there before really show how old I am. But, it's like he was huge back in the day when things were really ramping up with intelligent design. And he was famous for having, I think it was him, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but he was famous for having used this idea of a, mousetrap idea. Well, it's irreducibly simple. You can't get any simpler for it to its particular, usage. Therefore, God must have, created the universe. It's a little more complex than that, but that's just it. It's the idea here being is that simplicity, when looked at from a particular way, is not in and of itself capable of pointing towards truth. And we know this because many people are in fact looking and using this principle to promote any number of things that are like, wait a minute, what are we doing? Because part of what's going on is the notion of, well, what is going on here with what assumptions are needing to have this done? And in fact, you can look, I think YouTube has a ton of videos on this, but it's basically filled with people who actually used the mousetrap, removed even more mechanisms from it, and was using it primarily for like tie pins and a whole bunch of other things in order to show the fact that you could actually make it even more simpler. So in fact, this is kind of a ridiculous example to use. But
Oh, this is
yeah.
like the I think it was Richard Dawkins that has the book too, where he does the same thing with where
Mhm.
people are talking about, oh, well, how could the human eye have developed? It's just it's
Yep.
too complex.
Clicks, yeah.
Yeah, and he
Yep.
shows how there's this whole long range of other less complex structures that perform similar functions as an eye, and
Yep.
that become more and more, not simple, but I guess.
And in fact, I love that example. So thank you. I didn't cue you for that. So you're fine. But
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, it works. But the example is great because the eye is, depending on where you start in your point of view or perspective, eye point of view. Anyway,
See what you
is
did there.
that's what it is. This is what education gets you. This is
I
what I
see
like.
you.
Yeah. This is what copious amounts of
God.
student get you. There's lots of puns. And this is where we get into simple as far as biological. From what perspective or point of view is there something irreducible? And it's going to depend also then on functionality. And that was part of the fun in looking at both Dawkins and several others who've done an amazing job of looking at, wait a minute, yes, if we start here, it's complex and like, wait a minute, it's a little nuts but we can keep going and note that at each stage we can see the functional utility of being able to determine just simply light and dark, to then shadings, to then depth perception, to then just like you go all the way. I'm not a biologist, so I start losing the track of that example, but you can start seeing this. Now at the same time though, it does point us in the direction of like simplicity is not, well, simple. Parsimony is not as simple as, well, it sounds correct. It sounds simple, right? Therefore, it must be. Because then we get into, what are the nature of assumptions? I know. Like, wait a minute, where are we all going to go here? And part of this has to do with, what assumptions are you bringing to the table? What are the ones that you aren't even fully aware of? In fact, one of the things, so when I was a believer, I went through and I think many do, you go through you start with like evidence demands a verdict. You've got, McDowell's books and you thump them over people's heads. And then eventually you realize, there's some issues here. And then you delve into like presuppositionalism. So you're getting into, a whole bunch of things, Clark, and getting into, Lewis was a little bit into that. He was also an evidentialist. But anyway, there's actually a really great book written by a Christian about how evidentialism and presuppositionalism cancel each other out. It's fantastic. And I will eventually remember the title, but it was a great way of looking at why all of their philosophy doesn't work. But anyway,
interesting.
Fantastic. And so, but you go into this presuppositionalism where you're going, okay, well, my, for instance, epistemic principle is, the word of God. Literally, that is, in a nutshell, what they're saying. But of course, here's a great example of what assumptions do you start with? How simple is the notion of, well, just because you claimed simplicity or parsimony, does it really mean, where this, is it really mean what you think it means? And thank you for the Princess Bride reference. And, the idea there being, and they were, even at the time, it started dawning, is going, well, wait a minute. Okay, so you have, say, the word, i.e. the Bible, which, was part of a King James only group. That's a whole other thing in another time. But, it's like, okay, you're reading this thing, here's God's word. But what are all the rest of the assumptions that you have there? That your eyes work, that you're capable of understanding the words that are on the text. So there's several other epistemic principles that you're having to assume that have nothing to do, that you have to do prior to even getting to this point of being able to read. then you have to, look at, well, that not only that you understand the words, but the words that are on the page must therefore mean the same thing to the writer as it does to you, which is, then we've got a whole bunch of, interpretive issues and everything else. And then even further, it's like, well, that the words that we are then supposedly in that we're agreeing on, in fact, mean the same thing then as they do now and in perpetuity, which we know if anybody wants to have a lot of fun on linguistics, highly recommend. John McWhorter has a weekly syndicated thing. So I think the New York Times, where he goes into the history of words, and he's got a class as well on like A through Z, and he goes through the history of various words that are associated with each letter. So much fun. He's got a dry wit, and really what things used to mean, crazy. Just really, just lots of fun.
Well, and I mean, you make a good point there too. I mean, I know that we'll go off on a tangent if we get too far down this road, but I mean, to your point about words not meaning the same thing, I mean, when you read the King James Version of the Bible, there's not only words in there that are not words that we currently use in common English today, but then how far away are those from, the meaning that was intended hundreds to thousands of years ago? And like one example being, I know people have argued that the term, virgin birth was a mistranslation of the word virgin, meaning, a young woman or something like that, where that's a huge misunderstanding if people got that wrong.
Yeah. Well, and there's the classic example of, homosexuality, that it was a really bad translation. I mean, it's just like, there's a whole thing. Honestly, it's one of the reasons why I don't get into a whole bunch of proof texting or debates, because it's whatever you want to make out of it. And so I'm much more interested in taking a look at, well, why do you feel the need to have it mean this for you? Rather than let's get to the heart of what this really means, because there is no heart of it. Like it changes as time goes on. And yes, as somebody noted in the text, McWhorter's thing is Lexicon Valley. And it's also a great podcast. He has a fabulous voice. I can listen to him all, you can probably go to sleep to him. So you can just, whisper sweet nothings to me and I'll be great. But it's really a lot of fun with that. So part of what's going on here then is, again, this how simple ends up being extraordinarily complex, which hence a little bit at the admittedly poorly worded initial poll question, and going hence why there was an option of something smells bad here, because it's really nothing is that simple in the sense of it's largely based instead then on perspective and what are you trying to get at in your your inquiry. And so, and this is why, if for instance mentioned small TP, truth, certainly legitimate concept, but what exactly is it? Is it unchanging? And we start hesitating around the big T there. How, is there correspondence? Is it, internally, referential? Is there functional contextualism? Do you go into some of the postmodern stuff? I mean, it's just like crazy. And there's plenty of other good presentations that I believe have been on RfR that have gone through some of those things. Their shout out to go see the other 100 episodes.
Yes.
And so, but the difficulty here, beyond even the fact that simplicity ends up actually being quite complex most times, is that the brain doesn't care. It just doesn't. It is not concerned with the concept of truth. It is not. It is instead a functionally predictive machine. It is interested primarily in figuring out is the reality that it is aware of at any given moment, prepping you for having the resources available to deal with what it believes is coming next, maybe tomorrow, the next day, a week, a year from now, whatever. But what it believes is coming next, and determining then, okay, well, here's now your emotional reactions to dealing with whether or not you have the number of resources available. Hence why, for all of those who have been unduly and ridiculously and awfully affected by some of the rulings that have occurred in social change going on in the last week, if you found yourself not having as much energy for doing things that you otherwise were previously, if you find yourself, having a heightened anxiety response to things that otherwise didn't bother you, if you start, delving into a depression, you're like, where the hell is this coming from? It was fine. All of that is a response to the increase of an uncertain future. And so your brain is looking at that future and going, I thought I had the resources based on my past, i.e. the last 50 years of, constitutional right, anyway, that I could keep going forward with this understanding of how reality functions socially. Now that's cut out. And so what ends up happening then is there is a period of time, and it depends on a lot of variables, but there's a period of time in which you have to find a new state of equilibrium where you're going, okay, I am now a little bit more stable now as to figuring out what resources I need in order to then figure out how to deal with this new future. And that is going to require at minimum new experience and operating for a certain amount of time in this new world, as much as it sucks. So just as a caveat there, it's been coming up a lot in sessions recently with clients. And so you just really want to do a kind of a PSA around, if people are feeling it doesn't mean that there's something inherently wrong with you. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden you've contracted some new mental health issue. It means that your body, mind is dealing with what is now a bit more of an uncertain future. And it's going to take some time to figure that out. So
yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that. I think that is definitely something that's been on a lot of our minds lately. So that is definitely encouraging to know. You're saying it's not us that are broken, it's the world.
Well, yeah. And broken's a judgment. I don't disagree with it, but at the same time, and we'll get into actually some judgments here in a little bit, how that works. Yeah. Thanks, David. It'll save my therapist some effort tomorrow. You can have the therapist send me the check then. It's great.
Hey.
I'll be more than happy to help out with that. Anyway.
I'm taking a commission.
There is that, yeah.
Finder's fee right here.
Yeah. And so part of then, this stems then into or bridges then into from kind of epistemic assumptions and going into, well, the state of being, or let's throw out another $5 word, ontology. And we're figuring out, like, wait a minute, if our brains don't care about truth, doesn't mean truth isn't important. That's not what I'm saying. It's just that biologically speaking, that the higher concepts there that are largely contingent upon social mechanisms and relationships and so on, brain's really not, that's not its focus. It's not the point. And what it is figuring out, like, okay, so we have bodies that have, great data reading tools, i.e. our senses, but they themselves are building some of the data that we consider. For instance, we don't experience the world in the way that we see it. We are experiencing it, or we experience it at one level. The eyes are already, from a biological perspective, interpreting things a particular way. In fact, so there was I love, and still do, I love fantasy novels. I love magic. I love wizards. I love, like, just, oh my God, it's so much fun. And one of the things, particularly when I first started reading, was the Once and Future King, and where Merlin turned Arthur into a fish and turned him into a bird, and you're like, okay, figure out how the world functions. Well, it's a great literary tool for figuring out. I'm going to come back to that question about favorite fantasy novel in a bit, but it's a great literary tool figuring out, like, let's get into a different perspective. But if you actually ponder through, like, what would this mean? Like, if you were to literally, like, if you really, like, let's just figure, if I were turned into a fish, clearly I no longer have the brain that I now have. I no longer even have clearly I don't have the body that I have. So this gets, we could totally do a tangent on what it means to upload consciousness into a digital realm. But anyway, totally other thing. That's afterwards. But it's like we don't have a body that works within the world in a particular way. And we don't then have a brain that is interpreting through those mechanisms, that bodily mechanisms, then in a particular way. So any truth, even if you were capable of being conscious, which I got to admit, that would be disturbing. But even if you were conscious as a fish, you wouldn't be able to actually translate that back in any conceivable fashion to a human experience. Like, it just wouldn't work. In fact, if anybody saw the show, now I'm forgetting, but it had to do with sleeving, and it was a sci-fi, and where it was people got put into new bodies, like they could digitally put into consciousness. And what's the guy who played
Westworld? Westworld?
Carbon.
Oh yeah, Altered
Carbon.
Yeah, Altered Carbon.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah.
Fantastic book series, highly recommend. Not my favorite, still really good. But the TV show is fantastic, and the books go into it a little further, where there's a form of punishment from this guy who was extremely sick, was to actually put and install a person's consciousness into like a snake, and then pull them out months later, and they'd be insane. Like, they couldn't deal with that kind of functional difference in how they were interpreting the world. And so there's, it was a fascinating, psychological experiment as far as like thinking through, like, is there a biological limit to what we're capable of, experiencing and still maintaining our sense of humanity? Food for thought for drinks later. But right now since going off field, is come back then and going, okay, so we're particular creatures. We're living in the kind of like Newtonian middle world of physics, and because we don't actually experience consciously quantum collapse, so even though it's going on, so we're constantly dealing with the raw stuff of what our biology is allowing us to give. And so this is why, for instance, like, we have issues with eyewitness testimony. In fact, lawyers tend to hate it, despite what some of the TV shows love to portray, like, oh, the eyewitness, shut up, like, just we don't want to hear from you. We much rather deal with what is ostensibly referred to as objective evidence. And so why? Well, because we're terrible at actually coming up. And in fact, how memories work there's a quote from, yes, very much often flawed and open to interpretation. So from Julia Shaw's book, The Memory Illusion, highly recommend. She's just an amazing scientist. And she mentions in the book, our brains piece together information fragments in ways that make sense to us, and which can therefore feel like real memories. This is not a conscious decision by the rememberer, rather something that happens automatically. Two of the main processes during which this occurs are known as confabulation, i.e. self-referential lying, deception, and source confusion, i.e. not entirely certain where this piece of information may have come from, but I think if it serves my memory right there, you're probably wrong. But if it serves, then I probably remembered it here. This is where I got this, or this is who I heard it from, and so on and so forth. This is why, incidentally, you really need to have good references on academic papers.
No
But
kidding. This
yeah.
is why so is source confusion. Is this why sometimes I find myself telling a story to someone and then halfway through realizing they're the person that told me that story? And I'm like, oh, I thought you would think this is interesting.
It's like, yes,
You.
I told that to you originally, but the spin you put on it is great.
Yeah.
Like, I love what you've done with it. Like, this is
Yeah.
great.
You're saying I can't remember it perfectly? Oh no.
Or you're talking to someone and you had the same experience, but both of you remembered it completely differently. and there's gaps and like no, we went to Applebee's, no, we went to Chili's, no, we went to Applebee's. Like, you went out to dinner, you know it's a chain restaurant, but you won't get the name of the restaurant right.
Yes. And you'll even remember it, like you were saying, like your brain will insert details where like you're thinking, no, I had the ribs, I always get those at Chili's. Like, no, you didn't.
No. And in fact, that good example again. I need to have you on here. This is good. This is good. I don't even have to tell you the examples to use. You just do it.
One of us is psychic.
I'm fearless. I'm a fearless psychic. I have no fear of my psychic abilities, David. That's how I fill in the gaps, because I know everything. I'm psychic.
It works. And so what you're describing is that confabulation. We are piecing things together in a way that makes sense in the present, because that's how we're trying to figure things out. The brains don't care enough about the past other than as a useful tool to help us figure out what we need in the present to deal with an imagined future or a projected future. And so memory is not a roll tape idea. It's really a biological heuristic. So like there's a question around, does the brain create a more pleasing memory as a coping strategy? Absolutely, it can. And if the pleasingness has served a purpose in the past that was helpful in dealing with what you imagine a future is needing. So, because the opposite can be true. Brain can supply a continual source of awful memories, making things worse than they actually were. If in fact what it believes, based on a number, this is where how trauma will actually kind of become self-referential and builds off of itself, is because, and this is not a failing of anybody, we'll make that clear, it's just how things work, but it will often feed on itself precisely because the brain is going, this is going to keep happening, I need to keep reminding myself that I need to hunker down and make sure all my resources are set, because the world is a shitty place, and I know that true because that's all I'm remembering and that's what I'm basing it on. And I keep getting that, reinforced with further damaging. So, yeah.
Oh.
That's like, and does that lead back to like when people go through traumatic, they'll reinvent it in different ways in their lives. Because it's just because the memory is there, and we repeat, and we like pattern, and we like things to make sense. So even through trauma, we're trying to repeat patterns because it might be scary, but at least it's familiar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we really, 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 as a species, hate uncertainty, and it's just which makes sense once you get to the implanted memories here in a sec. But because it goes into this, is that it makes sense from a biological perspective, because uncertainty means the lack of predictive ability to make sure that your genes are going to continue on. And that's really all it's concerned with at a very basic level. It's not that there aren't other concerns. But at a very basic, like, that's what it's there. And if we're uncertain about how I can pass this along, well, then everything else is just for shit. Like, it's just really not going to matter much. And so so the consistency there, the fact that, thankfully the ensuring of, in fact, I'm not really all that concerned about my genes passing on at a certain level, because I got fixed, 20 years ago. But, but regardless of whether or not we consciously are kind of working through some of these things, biology doesn't really care. There is a little bit of an epiphenomenological thing going on here. Not completely, but that's a whole other thing. And so back to and this is where part of the implanted memories can happen. And in fact, Shaw, back to Julia Shaw and several others, one of the things that they do is really have stated, she unequivocally will state, it's really best to just simply acknowledge that we have no actual real memories in the sense that they're 100% true. Like just it's better to just operate from the perspective that nothing we remember is 100% accurate, and you're going to be better off in being able to have concern yourself with a greater humility around how you approach yourself and others, and around judgments, and around how you make decisions, because that's just, even the number of times that you might be is so infinitesimal that, like, why bother? Like, it's really not helpful to even think about it that way. So we can just all kind of operate like everything I remember is probably in some degree false, and that's okay, because it's true. Why get all hung up about it? But her and Loftus and many others, I mean, it's amazingly easy to implant memories. It is stunningly easy. I actually have a few myself that I can still recall that I know are fake. Like, I know they're real, but
How
if
do
I
you
spend,
know?
I went back and referenced some of the people before and was like, just having, they're like, now granted, I could say that, what they think, could be, but given what the memory entails, I'm like, no, that was definitely not. This is not what happened. Then the memory was entirely egoistic, and and here's one of the rules, and which we'll get into in a second here as well, is like anytime you start having certain things where you're telling the story, then it happens to be egoistically pleasing, odds are probably not as real as you might think. We really like to portray ourselves as better than what we actually are.
You mean I'm not the hero of every life event I've ever been involved in? What?
In your story, I'm sure.
You are the hero of your own story, Cara, as the rest of us. We are all special little snowflakes.
Yes.
Yep. Oh yeah. And that, the Satanic Panic was one that was huge in fact, there was a documentary around 2 or 3 kids that, if memory serves, they actually did get the death penalty and were put to death by the state. And it was entirely based on conjecture over they wore like Satan t-shirts in the town. They were in a small town. And it was like, no, you must have done this murder. And they clearly didn't, but in retrospect. But at the time, it was like, oh, here you go. So hence one of the reasons why I'm not a advocate for the death penalty. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, and on that note too, isn't that one of the things that the Satanic Temple now like has as one of their big projects is, kind of bringing awareness to the possibility of implanting false memories and all of the fallibility of all that drove the Satanic Panic back in the day.
All the kids that were getting interviewed by child psychologists and stuff like that, and they were planning memories of like child abuse that never happened. And it caused people to get like, sentences and put into prison for a long period on just conjecture of people just feeding kids bullshit, because kids are trusting and they will do things to please adults, and and they were never molested.
And in fact, in order to be horribly relevant, one of the reasons why do you see, for instance, when you go to more pro-life clinics kind of thing, and they, why do you see images of supposed, babies on these billboards and whatnot, and they're like, this is what you're aborting? No, that's a 24-week, no, this is, but the idea there is that once you've seen the image, once you've made the association, they have implanted the emotional connection in a deliberately manipulative fashion that is largely inevitable. We are prone to looking at baby faces in a particular way and having an emotional response, all of this is about engendering a particular response so that later on, some of the doubt and concerns and so on that you have in some capacity to varying degrees are manufactured by the influences that were put on you. And so and this is why advertising works. This is why politicians spend a ridiculous amount of money on ads, and we look at them and like, who falls for this shit? And we're like, actually, you don't have to fall for it. You just have to be influenced a little bit, by it. That's all that matters.
Because there have been plenty of times I've like go get healthcare at like Planned Parenthood, and there are protesters out there showing up like deaf fetuses, and even though I know they're it's just a bunch of propaganda, but like my emotional response instantly is it makes me deeply uncomfortable. And I'm not even going in for an abortion. I'm just going in to get a pap smear done, and I have to imagine if you're in a highly emotional state and you don't have your brain on and you're making very tough decision and the culture is telling you what you're doing is wrong. You're killing a baby when really you're just killing, you're getting rid of cells. It's that difference is it's uncomfortable for people. And if you don't have your brain on and kind of be like, yes, this is an emotional reaction, but let me work through it. People sometimes only respond to emotion.
Well, yeah, there's a lot.
I mean, general. I'm being general about this,
And generally, you're spot on, and that's where in order to bring this, we haven't gone off field. We are still talking actually about intuition and simplicity, and why is it? And this is a reason why it's enticing, because if you can engender a consciously simple response association, then you have helped influence this person. That's one of the reasons why it's enticing. We like things that are just, oh yeah, and here's where we get into, I know Rob has done a great overview of biases and all the cognitive issues before in others, in other presentations. And it's like, what intuition is it's a baseline impulse of a mind that is completely convinced it cannot be wrong. And that is what the heuristics and the biases and the stereotypes and so on and so forth come into play. As soon if anything is coming automatically, anything's coming immediately. So you have the proximity bias, you have the immediacy bias, you have, all of these things that are then going, well, isn't this simple? Is it, it came so simply to mind, didn't it? Therefore, it must be true. And if you can influence that in any way, hell yeah, that's a lot of power to have. And when you want to push an agenda, and this is everybody uses it. This is not like a mere it's only those conservatives that are doing it. Literally everybody does. And we just happen to agree with using it if we happen to agree with the point. And we'll get to that actually in a second. But but we're all doing it, and we're all bringing things up. Like, why do we tend to wear certain clothes on a date? Why do we portray ourselves in a particular way during a job interview? Why? Because we want people on the other end of this dialogue to have as simple of an intuitive, basic automatic response to us as possible that we had an influence in generating, so that we can guide the story that is being made between us. And that's why this whole thing is so enticing, because it's powerful.
Well, yeah, that's actually I feel like a really significant point that you've made. I mean, it's almost kind of scary to think, based on what you just said, it's so common for people to say things like, trust your gut, or, something like that, go with your gut, saying, trust these, intuitions and thoughts that you're having. But if, as you say, that is primarily being generated by these unconscious biases and assumptions that we have, then it almost sounds like it's more likely to be wrong, or, not true with a
Often.
little t. That's
Yeah.
kind of terrifying.
Well, and that's where we come back to the brain's not interested in finding truth. It's interested in finding a functionally consistent way of moving forward. Like,
Mhm.
it's, I'm not generally a big fan of quoting Ayn Rand, but she had a point in For the New Intellectual, I believe is where she said this. Probably said it in other places as well. But where it was like, to be rational, and I'm totally paraphrasing, but to be rational, to work out what it means to be reasoned and try to be objective is effortful. It requires work, which is why most people don't do it. Now, I will, and it's largely true, and it's not, and I don't want to. The caveat to all of that is that really what we're doing is we are being, in fact, rational all the time. We really are. It's not like our emotional brains take over. It's not that there's some war that's going on. Or it's that there isn't two things at work. There is one thing at work that doesn't actually work the way that we'd like it to be. We like to think of ourselves as as rational creatures, and in fact, we get this, oddly enough, a little bit from Christianity, because one of the things that Homo Deus, in God's image and so on, that we were supposedly created, was in our rational faculties. So this whole notion of we are these, rational, objective beings that can parse out the truth of the world is unfortunately still a hangover from, some apologists from 16th, 17th century or so. Could be wrong there by 100 years or so, but it's around. It's in there. It was for the purpose. How do we separate ourselves from the animals? Well, because we have brains that are rational, because the animals aren't. Spoiler alert: you're still an animal.
Yeah, I was going to say, this whole preoccupation with what makes humans different from animals is so funny to me, because every time we seem to pick out what that is, we subsequently discover, oh no, wait, these animals do that too.
Right. Like if you find out, like if you watch like corvid birds, or that actually plan, like how to get like, certain things of food and stuff like that. Like they do plan, they rational things out. Octopuses rational things out. So it's just like, yeah, like we're not that special. Yeah. I hate to tell you. Sorry. Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert, we're all animals.
Yep.
Yep. And in fact, so this brings up, trying to take a look at the time, is that from Julia Galef. I love the Julias, just the way it is. Her book, The Scout Mindset, is that one of the things, like, no, just because you think you're objective does not mean that you actually are, or you're being rational. And so she said, in fact, viewing yourself as rational can backfire. The more objective you think you are, the more you trust your own intuitions and opinions as accurate representations of reality, the less inclined you are to question it.
Ooh.
Yeah.
So
I
basically,
love bringing that up.
Don't be so arrogant. That's the thing.
Well, and it's there is arrogance, but there's also let's just recognize that, again, our brains are not consumed with finding out truth. Truth is a fantastic conceptual idea that has been extremely helpful in creating, well, the fact that we're literally possessing the power of gods right now. Like, we are all over the country in real-time conversation and visioning. Like, if you were to take the internet and Zoom meetings back to Greece, like they'd be like, are you, like, we need to expand the pantheon here. Like, you have taken on the power of gods and made it normative. Mm-hmm. And it's just a rather astounding thing. And we've done that by having these ideas around truth, and the idea that our thoughts should, the scientific method is, how do we correspond? Do our thoughts actually represent, through experimentation and probabilistic, theory, closer approximations of how we then actually find ourselves dealing with reality? And so it's hugely helpful. It's been amazing.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, brains don't actually care. Like, that takes a lot of work to keep at this, which is why it's so easy to get into that kind of soldier mindset. Came back to it. And the idea of treating ideas in a warfare, and why it's so, unhelpful in this process, because warfare is about taking ownership of parcels in order to then make sure it never gets taken over by another. It's about that. If you are attacked and if you give up your position, you are now weak. How is that helpful? No, we actually want to be weak in that sense when it comes to considering our ideas about ourselves, about the people around us, about how we go about having dialogue. We want to actually consider ourselves as weak in that sense. Hence the movement away from a soldier mindset where things are a constant battle to one of what's out there. Like, what more is there to discover? Not going to get into criticisms of some of the new Star Trek, shows, but the quality here is still, I'm a huge fan of the Orville, just going to say that. But anyway, it's like the quality here really is about, like, there is still that core kernel of going out there and going, no, our fundamental drive as human beings is to discover and figure out both what we believe is true actually ends up being true and being thrilled, and at the same time, what we believe is true just isn't, and being thrilled for that as well, like actively engaging in. And
Like, I'm excited to be wrong.
Hell yeah, it is. It's
Well,
amazing.
Cause I was talking to, some friends like a few days ago, and I said, like, I want to be corrected. Like, if I'm making a wrong statement, please tell me. I don't want to look like an idiot. And I trust that other people may have more knowledge on a subject than I do, because there's only so much information you can take in, and you just kind of get like this layman's understanding. Like, we all naturally accept that the earth is a globe, but how do we know that? Like, what is the actual science that's behind it? Like, we just assume it. But then when you actually learn how that was discovered and why the science works behind it, your mind, that one little thing of just, yes, we live on a globe, but once you actually learn the science and why the science is sound, it just expands your brain a little bit more, instead of things like, it's just obvious that we live on a globe, because you're talking to someone that doesn't think that, they're going to be like, no, it's not that obvious, Yeah.
Well, and in fact, that statement, well, isn't it obvious, is really just a phrase synonym. Yes, I just coined that, for, well, isn't that simple? Isn't shouldn't that be an intuitive point? Like, obviously, right? I mean, why do you even need to think about it? It's obvious. Well, wait, no, it's really not. In fact, this is why I love photography, just as an art form, but I love it as a way of expressing and exploring perspective, because especially when it comes to like digital photography and editing, is that when you recognize, and there are some great videos out there on YouTube like showing the editing process, and people can take like a shot where you go, there's nothing in that. Like, it's just shades of darkness, and then they'll expand the exposure and expand the highlights and the shadows and figure all this stuff out, and before you know it, you've got, oh, there's an entire forest and a bridge and maybe some animals over there, and you've got this whole picture. Because the reality is, when shooting in RAW, there is so much information there that as you edit, you are picking and choosing what information to highlight or darken and what to emphasize in order to make and portray the picture as you want it as an artist. You know, Rick Salmon, famous photographer, has noted that, you know, photographers are essentially light artists. You know, they are using illumination, i.e., I mean, let's just say it's a stand-in for inquiry, to discover what you think you saw, but are still trying to figure out. Like, did I actually see this? Or perhaps did I see it and now there might be a different way of looking at it? And so we're going to highlight this and we're going to like blow up that. And it's a phenomenal way of being able to work through, and you don't need a really expensive camera. You can do this actually with most phones these days, some basic editing software. But you just start working through, like, I really considered where that was. And if that was there and I didn't see it, then what else is going on that I haven't seen? And that should cause us some concern of any time anything starts feeling like, well, isn't it obvious? Or this is simple, or, you know, this should be clear to anybody, right? Well, it's not. And quite often it's not a personal failing. It's just simply, again, biological machines, the information isn't there. And further, it's not there because information isn't the solution here necessarily. In fact, Galef goes into, and there's plenty of others who have gone through this as well, is noting that oddly enough, more information. So for instance, she uses the example of global warming or global climate change, whatever, you know, and she goes through and notes how when you crunch it's often typical to hear well, if you're conservative, you don't actually believe in this and so on. And it has to do with, well, if you just know the facts, you'll get it. Well, you crunch the information of the polling and you parse out the information as far as the number of people who actually then are aware of scientific understanding. And the numbers don't actually change much. In fact, if anything, they get wider apart. The more information a person knows, generally speaking, means that they are even more partisan in their opinions. Mm-hmm. So simply sharing information to people rarely works. Sometimes it does, but it works not because of the information being shared, but because of the other things going on, the social influences, the relationship that you have with them, and so on. All of these things are far more influential than any number of data points that you can throw at somebody. And in fact, yeah, I know, drones, like, really? It's so much easier to throw facts at people, like, come on. Yeah. And yes, the Colbert Report reality, the well-known liberal bias, of course, said by a liberal, is the easy rejoinder to that. And so the last couple of minutes, so some getting through all of this and going, okay, well, what are some principles for, yes, do your own research. Yeah, well, and in fact, why does that not work? Because even if it's decent research, the research that you are going to look after, the evidence, because it still is evidence, is going to unmiraculously support the conclusion that you were wanting in the first place. Like, to really change one's mind is if the term miracle can actually still be used in a secular way, that actually is a good way, is a good place for that, because it really is astounding anytime somebody actually changes, which is why in some ways we should all pat ourselves on the back that we left religion behind. Anyway.
Yeah, that's a great point. So would you say that having that kind of scout mindset approach is part of what makes it possible to change your mind? Is that kind of what you're driving at here?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And in fact,
tell us how.
Yes. So in fact, as Galef notes, being able to name, say, reasonable critics, being willing to say the other side has a point this time, being willing to acknowledge that when you were wrong, it's actual actions. You can talk about being objective, you can talk about being rational all the time long. I don't really care. I really don't. And I'm saying this as much to me as much because I love saying that. I'm like, God, I'm trying to curb some of these things because it's just not actually helpful. It's the how are we reacting to people that actually distinguishes, as she puts it, people who actually care about truth, lower T, from people who only think they do. And so some of those actions is like, so do you tell other people when you realize you're right? How often have you gone out of the way once realizing that somebody was accurate to go, wow, yeah, you're right. Thank you for that. That's great. You know,
Ooh.
how do you react to personal criticism? Do you take it as a personal affront that your identity is about to be shattered? Or do you take it as a, okay, I mean, maybe. Well, let's delve into this, a little bit, or as much as you can in a given circumstance. 3, like, do you ever prove yourself wrong? And this
Constantly.
means
Intentionally or
Good.
accidentally?
Constantly. I know I'm wrong all the fucking time.
All the time.
All
Yes.
the time. I'm like, oh yeah, you're an idiot, Helen. I'm like, teach me, Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yes, the
Being an
self-own
idiot's a little bit
is
of,
something that happens to me occasionally.
Yes. Yep. Yep. And so, do you take precautions to avoid fooling yourself? Especially if you're about to enter a situation where, by and large, you've been right most of the time before, at least you think you have been. Like, what, have you taken, like, I really, really want to be right this time. What can I put in here to kind of curb that tendency, in me? Do you have any good critics? This went into this. It was a second polling question. Like, how often do you actually ponder and look at people, and read and listen and watch and so on, people of different perspectives and different political persuasions, and people that otherwise you might not want to have a drink with, but hey, this is the steel manning thing is often is being looked at. And and lastly, can you point to occasions in which you were in the soldier mindset?
Ooh.
Little counter there. There it is. Can you point to occasions in which you were in the soldier mindset? Because we are all going to sink into it. We just are. We're going to take positions and hold that fort and consider any kind of movement as some kind of weakness or problem in who we are. It's a bone deep tendency that we all have. But he recently just had reading her book was a bit of a mea culpa. But it's like recently just had where it's like posted this article and somebody made a comment about it on social media where humanity goes to die. And it's like and it was an absurd thing about some global conspiracy, and actually the article was inverted. Really what it is this mass conspiracy of people who are billionaires looking to run our lives. And my initial response was just be like, that's really the funniest shit I've heard all day. And to say that was not helpful in having any kind of legitimate conversation buries the meter and obviousness. And tried to salvage it, didn't. And and on one hand, it's like, yeah, do I still find the position ridiculous? Yeah. I mean, let's be honest, I do. At the same time, there is a difference between finding a position ridiculous or at least probabilistically near zero and treating it as if it's a cornerstone of their identity, because then I'm falling into the same error that gets me in trouble. And in fact, if I could add a principle on this, is that we need to think less from an identity perspective and more from the pursuit of being wrong. So for instance, every time we perhaps can catch ourselves going, I'm an atheist. Really? Maybe you are, but it has to be this, and from that I believe this. Every time we start there, we make it more difficult to question what we believe is so. Even if we might be right, it's totally fine, we might be, but is the pursuit here an issue of being right, or is it about facilitating the space for further conversation in order to allow for more people to have flexibility so that we don't persist in this soldier mentality where at the end of the day, if that's all we have, then all we have is violence.
Mm.
Eventually, that's where it leads. And that is not going to be helpful for small L liberalism and creating a society where a whole bunch of people of varying opinions and various craziness can get along. I mean, I love, what is it? One of my favorite, so here it is, one of my favorite, the sci-fi series would be the Dune series by Frank Herbert, to varying degrees, the follow-up books by his son. And one of the things that was absolutely fascinating about it was his conjecture that even 10,000 years into the future, they find themselves being helped out by Jews. No joke. Like they have interstellar consciousness driven interstellar travel, and you literally have people who are still functioning to waiting for their Messiah. And you're going, no, I can see it. Like it may not be, them necessarily. This was an affectation from Herbert, but it's like, but he's saying no. And if we can still have that and still be able to have all that, they have interstellar travel and figuring out all these things, like, is it really the end of the world to have a bunch of crazy ideas out there at times, or things that are probabilistically near zero? No. And in fact, the more space we allow for people to just go, yeah, you know what, could be, but you don't have to, raise arms about it. The better we get along with actually being able to move forward anyway. I mean, it's a often criticism of the difference between what has often happened with a lot of historical reasons for this, but that what Christianity in many ways has done, and Islam is now going through, is having an enlightenment, where in many ways what they've done is in most circles, contrary to the circles that are running the Supreme Court, but anyway, most circles, it's less of an issue of this militarism and more of a, can we just get along? Because they've taken on the secularism of what worked, because it allowed them to continue functioning without the burden of having to constantly fight. And the less you have to fight, the more freedom you have to be able to express.
Man, I love that. Just that idea that, you're some belief or thought that you have doesn't have to be your identity. It's so simple. But in a good
and really, really difficult.
But we've had these conversations before where when you start like if you're coming from I'm right and I'm going to tell you why I'm right, and you start attacking someone to bring them over to your side, and you're not listening to them, you just want to be militant about it and be like, no, I'm right, me, you're like, you're believing in God is stupid, me, and let me bring you over to my side. You're not going to change their mind at all. You're not going to even get them to see even 10% of your perspective, because you're attacking them, and nobody wants to be attacked. And two, it's like, I don't think someone that believes in God is right, but I'm willing to say, I don't know. That's it. That is a good even position to come from. I don't know, even if, because you're just trying to get them to you're just trying to get along and to kind of see where the other person is coming from. And as soon as you start thinking you know everything, and especially already know what they think, that is a bad place to start from, because you don't know somebody else's mind, and it's just bad mojo. Don't do it, guys. Don't do it. Your fearless psychic is telling you not to do it.
She knows things.
I know things.
But in fact, using the example from Gail's book again, as far as the global climate change is concerned, when you first started, like overall, there's a decent amount of consistency and agreement that this is existing and this is occurring, and we need to deal with the effects of it and so on. It's when you start making it part of an identity, when you start adding even more information and making that information a part of whether or not you are therefore then belonging to the right group, basically the no true Scotsman fallacy writ large into the problems of identity politics, which all sides do. And it's like, well, as soon as you no longer have room to question, I mean, I've reflected before in the past that had I been a part of a Christian group that was extraordinarily liberal and allowed for any number of questioning to exist, who knows if I'd ever left. I mean, really, part of leaving was not being allowed to ask certain questions. You know, like, no, you don't want to go there. You don't want to go there. Well, wait a minute. Now I'm definitely leaving. Like, I want the freedom to be able to have my own inquiry. Thank you very much. And so, you know, we want to create that space as much as possible in allowing for that flexibility, because at the end of the day, actually, in many cases, end up agreeing more than we don't.
Man, that is a really good point. I really like the way you put that, and you're right. Why maybe we should be careful not to take on the attitude and posture towards other people that pushed us away from from some of our former beliefs in the first place. No, I was just gonna say this has been, really fascinating, and we do have a lot of good questions. And the one that I am most interested in hearing the answer to is the one you promised us. You've been teasing us. What is your favorite fantasy novel or series?
Yeah, it's difficult to say it's fantasy. I mean, Lord of the Rings will always have like, it was the first fantasy novel I ever read was Fellowship of the Ring in like third grade. And it's
love
been
you.
a favorite
As a Tolkien
forever.
nerd, I love you.
Oh my God, yeah. But have deeply appreciated Sanderson. Robert Jordan has in his Wheel of Time series is just phenomenal. Definite criticisms, but it's just incredible. And in Sanderson, who finished it up, and then he has his entire Mistborn and his whole Cosmere thing that he's got going on, where all of his books are related. It's just insanely complex and amazing characters and dialogue. It's really, yeah, it's so much fun. Yeah.
Okay. So you've given us more than one thing to check out. I approve.
Fantasy. No, the Bible's not my favorite fantasy book. But,
It's terribly written.
Yeah.
The dialogue. It needs an editor.
Yeah.
The chapters don't all flow.
And some of the protagonists are not somebody you want to get behind.
What was it? Who was it that said that the Old Testament God is the most unpleasant character in all of fiction?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. He has anger issues he needs to work out. like he needs a therapist, maybe a glass of wine.
I look at the New Testament God as like the Old Testament God's beard.
Right.
He's serving as God's beard in order to make you think that it's gotten better.
No. It's a trap.
It's a trap.
Yeah.
So, David, what are some methods to separate emotion from such information?
You don't.
Oh, well, that was a simple one.
And I get this question, some variation of it, all the time in therapy and in coaching, and it is just flat out a misnomer that reason and emotion are counter to one another. It's simply not the case. And what emotion is there are two aspects of it actually, but one is the label we apply to our felt experience around it. That's where we get into emotion words. At a biological level, what we have is, various states of arousal, low or high, and varying states of what Scouser refers to as valence, or what it means is the intentional weight on something. So, and that's contingent upon, again, based on previous examples that the brain is aware of, understood through the present, in order to figure out whether or not you're going to be able to deal with the future. And so you can never get rid of emotion because it's constantly there, you know, providing the impetus that allows us to go, that's important. And now I'm going to have a whole, you know, ad hoc or post hoc rationale about why that's important to me. When really it was your brain telling you, by the way, pay attention, this is important. And so if what we want, and what I think often what is actually meant by that question is how do we not react in automatic ways that end up being unhelpful and unhealthy when we feel like we've been overwhelmed, when the arousal of the state is so huge that we engage in behavior that we reflect in cooler moments later, like, oh, that was really dumb. And part of this is practice. And that is practicing slowing the F down. Like literally when you're not in a state of like full on fear or trauma, arousal, of whatever state that may be, is taking a breath. Like it can be as simple as that. Like before you and go from room to room and even your house or apartment or hotel room, you know, it's going, okay, what do I want to do here again? All right, I'll be doing this. Why am I doing this? Oh, because I care about, you know, hygiene, because, you know, I'm about to go take a shower or brush my teeth or whatever. And it's like, why am I going to this? Well, because I want to get food. Why am I doing that? Well, I'm entering this room because I want to talk to my spouse or my partner or whatever. It's slowing down to consciously take ownership of the actions you're about to do. So that even if you do end up doing the behavior that was just on it came up, that's fine, but at least you're owning it. You're taking responsibility for it. And the more often you do this, the more often you create the space later when things are heightened, you get into the habit of going, okay, I'm really pissed off right now. Yeah, totally legit. Every single emotional reaction internally is always legit. It's what we do based on it that now has a question of legitimacy and we're not even necessarily legitimacy so much as, is it going to serve what you want to serve, i.e. the values that matter to you, in the way that is best for the situation? And we need to be able to slow down and create the space for that flexibility to come up. And in fact, somebody asked, what's the point of, you know, like, what's the purpose of imagination? That's it. Imagination is the cognitive power of being able to flexibly respond to new situations or to situations in new ways. That's what imagination is fundamentally. And that means why it's so good to engage in new experiences and new, you know, ideas, and getting out and having conversations with people from wildly different cultures, because the more possibilities that imagination has to take a hold of, the more possibilities we then have to extrapolate from those and make new things in, you know, from what we've done in the past. That's what it all boils down to.
Wow, I really like that. I wrote that down in the chat, what you just said there about imagination. That was good. Was awesome. Okay.
Good.
Yeah. So here's another one then that someone just asked about. And I'm kind of curious to hear your answer to this as well. Someone was saying that they're having a hard time actually finding arenas where they can find a genuine discussion of conservative ideas. So, for example, they find all these sources like Turning Point USA, Fox News, r/conservative, etc. But these, I think what the questioner is asking is, you know, these seem, you know, very, very kind of polarized in a particular way. But they're having a hard time finding, you know, a place where they can actually have a discussion about these ideas and actually engage with them in a productive way. Do you have any suggestions for how people can kind of get out of their echo chamber, but not out of the frying pan into the fire?
So as far as groups to go to, it's really tricky. Groups by definition tend to not be really great for having group conversation, oddly enough. And I mean, you can look for there are groups out there that are around like around the having impossible conversations. Go through that book and use it. And if it's done well, you can have some really fruitful conversations around that. But really, I go to certain sources. So like, I know I've probably mentioned before in a different presentation when I was asked something similar, actually. Tom Nichols, he wrote The War on Expertise. He's written a couple of others as well. It's just, he's a old school Reagan conservative who is a never Trumper, and just a fascinating mind. And he's got a couple of recent articles actually who just went after the Supreme Court and what they've recently done. As a conservative, like he is full on still very much, and he's a believer as well. Like, so, but he's one of the most thoughtful people I've ever encountered. David French is another one that I recently more encountered and cannot recommend him enough. I certainly don't agree with everything that he says, but his analysis, in fact, he recently had he was interviewed by Sam Harris on Harris's podcast, and I cannot recommend that one enough. That was a hour and 50 minutes of amazing analysis of the religion's influence, why Trump rose up in such why this person who on the face of it is utterly anathema to everything they stand for, and why they fell for it, and in some of the ways that have gone in, the changes in gun culture, they went all over the place. It is fascinating. In fact, it made me shake my head and made my wife laugh, because there was a point that French made that I totally missed in the analysis of all of it. And I missed it precisely because I have actually gone away from seeing how Christianity is so pervasive in American culture, which I consider good that I've gotten away from that. It's no longer like always in my head all the time, but at the same time, because of it, I ended up missing this point. So when French made it, I was like, right, like there it is. Like, so absolutely amazing. I do believe it's I think Harris made it outside of a paywall, so I think anybody can listen to it. But a couple of people are leaving. Good night. But yeah, he was the chosen one. In fact, and it was prophecy, in fact, that French notes played a huge influence. And one of the difficulties is that the notion of prophecy, and really even any understanding of Christianity, doesn't largely exist in most liberal institutions. Like, they just really don't consider it. In fact, there was an example. There was somebody who back early 90s or so, early 2000s, because I had moved on from Christianity by then. But I think it was an interview late night with forget his name, but she was going through like the notion of the rapture, and the notion of this premillennial theology, and this I forget what it was, but he leaned over, it's like, people believe that. I think it was a woman. It was some book that she was promoting, and she was like, yeah, millions do. And it influences their voting behavior, and it influences the policy decisions they get behind it. And he's like, and he was Letterman, and he just looked at her like she'd grown 3 heads. Like he couldn't compute what that meant, and that is unfortunate. Really, like it's unfortunate that he couldn't, because it's such a huge blind spot in far too many people in institutions. They're like, this is being an influence, and if you're not seeing it, you're gonna miss and get blindsided later on. So,
I mean, like, I would love to live in the bubble. I want to live in Letterman's bubble of not being fully aware that a huge voting bloc lives in prophecy and biblical Yeah, they're waiting for revelation to actually be a thing, so that's concerning. I want to live in the bubble where I don't know about that, but I do.
Yeah,
Fuck
unfortunately.
me.
Yeah,
Sometimes being an informed person isn't all it's cracked up to be.
yep. Well, and it's that, where is a comment that I made, recently around, Europe had its 100-year war, in order, and one of the consequences of it was to recognize just how much religion should not be a part of political, social life. And unfortunately, barring other variables of which I'm still minutely positive for. Nobody ever, can mistook me for a rah positivist, but is that we could be really looking at our own kind of 50-year version of it, where the ascendancy of certain ideology for a lot of variables, is going to be up, and it's going to take a whole generation to really kind of go, oh, so this is how bad it can be. Oh, hell no, we are not doing this ever again. And unfortunately, in the process, a lot of people are going to be hurt to just awful degrees. And I hope it's not true, but yeah, that's where we're at. And the more we understand it, the better we can do to deal with it, and create the space for it to kind of drift away and get so and dissolve amidst all the rest of it. So yeah.
So I'm going to move on to the next question. No, I know it's a thing.
All right, so I think we should
Welcome
all
to
join
the
a
thing.
commune and watch porn together. I love. Thank you. Sorry, I'm about to say your name. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, join a commune. Watch porn together. I can get behind this. Yeah.
No, we can do the porn commune.
Yeah, it's our version of Disney. Come on.
It's exactly.
It's fine.
We garden and we watch porn.
This is a nude commune, right?
Yeah.
Of course,
we
if we're
had
gonna
an
do
episode about
if we're
that.
gonna do the porn commune, Cara, it's gonna be nude.
I mean, sorry, I didn't know if it just seemed obvious to me or if it seemed obvious to everyone. I didn't want to assume.
I'm the psychic, so I know it's gonna be nude.
That's true. That's true.
I know. So what is it, David, about writing the OTU pros, cons, and thoughts about a decision or problem that makes it easier to handle?
Say that again. I don't think I caught.
What is about writing out pros, cons,
pros
and thoughts?
Cons. That's right. That's right. Okay, I remember that question. So there are two. Honestly, this just came up recently with a guy that were a little late last week. So there are two things about writing pros and cons. Is that pros and cons typically, and it's a good way to start in helping make decisions and gaining greater flexibility. But it's only a starting ground, because what ends up happening with a pro con sheet is that we get sucked into a hyper behavior focus, a hyper outcome focus. And so we end up getting blind to all of the other possibilities. So for instance, really, what is FOMO, fear of missing out, really about? Well, it's so focused on this one thing or this set of things that could have happened over there. Wait a minute, why do you have to get stuck on those things? What's the fundamental thing about the grass is greener on the other side practice? Well, why is that a problem? Well, because you're so focused on a particular behavioral outcome or particular situational outcome that that you become blind. It's back to that principle of the more you talk about how objective you think you are, the less inclined you are to think about the ideas and thoughts that you're sharing. Same thing with, and that's often what ends up happening with pro-con sheet. So what I often recommend is that you totally start there, because it's a great way of identifying what might be missing and what your some things that you miss from a different situation or would like in a new one. But then you take the next step and take all those behaviors and tie them back to what are the core value-based things that matter to you. Like, is this behavior about family? Is it about integrity? Is it about honesty? Is it about fitness? Is it about financial security? Is it about social cohesion and relationships and say power and influence? Like, all these are values that manifest their way through various stories into different behavior. And if we focus only on the behavior, we're going to miss out on, one, why we care, and two, we'll miss out on the flexibility that it comes from starting from a place of values, which incidentally are, in my view, the kind of cognitive flip side of our emotions. Like, we only ever really feel things based on things that matter to us, i.e., why would you ever get upset about things you don't give a shit about? I mean, really, why? So it's the same thing with love, insecurity, and everything else. Like, we have emotional reactions because something, more than one thing, has been supported or violated. And what those things are what matters to us. And our emotions are big old ringing signs to totally mix metaphors there, to let us know that something was important is occurring in that moment.
I kind of like the ringing signs. I feel like that's a good term for us in our postmodern, linguistic discussion here.
I've got trains on my mind for some reason. I'm hearing the thing coming down, ding, 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 like,
oh, trains! You should have told us we were doing trains this week. I had everybody.
Now we come back to the commune and point. Yeah. Anyway. Okay, not safe for work any longer.
Fair enough. Yeah, and on that note, I guess we should probably start wrapping up here so we can get to the hangout session where we can talk about all sorts of other topics with the recording turned off. So what say you we move on to that?
Sounds fabulous.
Outstanding. Well, once again, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us about this topic tonight. It is always a pleasure having you on here. This is, I think you said, the 6th time that you've been here, and every time has been fantastic and amazing, and I've learned so much. So I cannot wait for number 7, which will hopefully be soon. So yeah, absolutely. Look for David to join us again. We're not allowing him to say no.
You're gonna be voluntold, David.
Yes, yes. I'm in the habit of voluntelling people things lately. So you're next up. I'm telling you, you're coming back, whether you like it or not. But we really do enjoy having you. So thank you so much.
Okay, if you can't get enough RfRx people, or if you want to tell people about us, I have a way you can do it. Okay, you can go to our Facebook page. All right, so we have a Facebook support group, we have the regular RfR Facebook, our group project, all that wonderful stuff. So please go to our Facebook, and you can also engage with agents and other people that are involved with recovering from religion on our Facebook. Same with on the Twitter machine. It's not all a cesspool on Twitter. So if you like RfR, it's great on Twitter. So come see us on Twitter. Also come see us on the Instagram. Come see us on the TikToks. There's little videos up by agents and our wonderful board members on the TikTok. So please go there. Also too, if you want to learn more about RfRx, our RfR news, recent published videos, related blog posts, all types of that fun stuff, please sign up for our newsletter. It will come to your inbox frequently. I don't know how often, but it shows up, and you can learn things about things that we have coming up, like other RfR talks about the fall excursion, about other events we are doing, or just to read about how awesome we are. And you want to do that, you do. So please go, please sign up for our newsletter. Okay, I am out. I hope everybody has a wonderful 4th of July if you're on this side of the pond. I'm not feeling super independent right now, but I'm going to do my best to be a good American until the apocalypse happens, which is pretty cool. I'm like, I've always wondered what it's like to live in a dystopia. So now that it's happening, I'll get to find out. Yay!
Yay!
So, yay! Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to you, Cara. Everybody have a great 2 weeks, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, I am looking
Thanks, Helen.
forward to your prescient comments on our future as well as
That's right.
the psychic.
Listen, if you want to say predictions, I will give you my PayPal, and for $19.99, I'll tell you your future.
They're not free.
They're not free, no, and they're going to be kind of vague.
Yeah, that tracks.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it. All right. Well, thank you for that. And speaking of awesome and amazing and prescient comments, I do want to introduce our fantastic president and founder of RfR, Dr. Darrel Ray. Would you like to give us a few closing comments?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. This has been great. There's a lot of tidbits in here. I hope you guys were taking notes, because about every 5 minutes there was something popped in there that I hope people are listening to that. So I really appreciate the practical side, because I think there's a lot of practical pieces that could be taken out of what you just told us. I think something that's really interesting is people are always trying to separate emotion from logic, and I loved your answer. You can't. I thought that was great, because every thought you have is attached to some emotion you probably have had or will have or whatever. So just acknowledging that really helps you start moving forward. And I think you've hit on something that I really find valuable, and that is our brains are just trying to problem solve within the environment we're in. And it's hard for us to get our heads around that notion that the environment changes, our brains are going to engage and now try to figure out what to do next. And the more we can understand that, the more mindful we can become about that. Because I think a lot of anxiety is people's problem solving motor going out of control. And they can't find the solution. So their brain just keeps going faster and faster and faster. Now that's simplifying it. And you and I could probably have a long conversation about that. But the fact is that that's what our brains are doing. They're trying to solve a problem. And sometimes the problems are unsolvable. And when your brain gets racing, we need methods and tools for changing that and bringing the racing down and taking a deep breath and putting, pros and cons or whatever you need to do. I just love it. Everything you said, I just kept thinking, this is good stuff. So if you are interested in this kind of stuff, come back. If you are interested, volunteer. There's lots of things we need help on. And if you can't volunteer and you'd like to help us in some other way, hopefully you can donate, or you can put us up on your social media and let people know about us. Anyway, thanks again, David. Thanks so much, Kara and Helen, for making this all happen. I know how much work it is behind the scenes. And thanks for troll stomping tonight, our troll stompers, Glenda, Gail, Rob, whoever's trumped them. Anyway.